The environmental movement had two main goals. The first was to raise awareness and gather support, while the second was to lobby for actual legal change by proposing different bills and pushing them through the House and the Senate, hoping that they would make it into law. There have been environmental activists since the early 1900s, but in the 1960s and 1970s, the environmental movement started to gain mass and had millions of followers and supporters all over the United States and around the world. One key thing that started to raise awareness about the environmental movement was Rachel Carlson's book, Silent Spring, which talked about the death of birds due to the chemical DDT commonly used in farming. This was a mass-published book and reached millions of Americans. One of the environmental movement's biggest promoters of their cause, Earth Day, was first held on April 22nd in 1970. This event has continued to grow and is now held all over the world on the same day, with millions of people celebrating it around the globe. The first piece of legislation that was helped be put into place by the modern environmental movement was the Clean Air Act, passed in 1970. This act essentially allowed the government, in the EPA, which was also formed in 1970, to limit the amount of chemicals and pollutants that companies could put out into the air, as at the time, factories were allowed to put out whatever they wanted. In 1970, the same year that the Clean Air Act was passed, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed. This was the governmental agency that was essentially in charge of regulating all environmental law to come in the future. This agency had the power to prosecute any companies or individuals that were found to be in violation of any environmental laws. This was a first for the time. Another piece of legislation that was put into place by the environmental movement was the Clean Water Act of 1972. This was very similar to the Clean Air Act, except it dictated what kinds of pollutants, if any, and in what quantity, could be dumped into protected bodies of water. In 1972, not very many bodies of water were protected, and this was a problem because corporations were taking advantage of this and dumping their waste in other unprotected bodies of water. Amendments in 1977 and 1987 solved this problem, protecting most bodies of water. Because of the awareness raised by the environmental movement, we can see a large social shift in the 1960s and 1970s, with millions of Americans actually getting out and using the national parks and trail systems put into place by FDR and his New Deal program. With this raised awareness and more people going outside and actually appreciating the outdoors, the environmental movement gained an even larger following, with all these people going home and telling their friends about how great the environment was and that it needed to be protected so that others could enjoy this as well. Later on, in the 1980s, with the environmental movement being established as a popular front and technology being much more advanced than it was in the 60s and 70s, scientists and environmentalists alike began to investigate into using alternative sources of fuel such as wind farms and solar panels. This marked the first time that we, as a country, started to look into alternative fuel sources instead of using the typical coal, natural gas, and other petroleum products. The environment was not the only thing that was helped by the environmental movement. The economy was helped as well. With the creation of the EPA, thousands of jobs in enforcement were also created because the EPA needed people that could go out to companies and factories to ensure that they were following the legislation that had been put in place by Congress. Jobs were also created in construction because with the added interest in the outdoors, more and more people are using the trails, and the trails simply needed to be maintained more often and new trails needed to be built to support the growing interest. The environmental movement is still ongoing today, but the roots that were planted in the 1960s and 1970s have had a long-lasting impact even in today's society. Without the environmental movement, it is possible that alternative energy sources would not have been developed until much more recently. This would mean that our country would still have been relying completely on fossil fuels up until a much more recent date, making us much more inefficient and hurting the environment even more. Thanks to the environmental movement, we now have these technologies. Perhaps the longest lasting and most important impact the environmental movement has had on this country and the world as a whole is the awareness and education that it has brought to us about the environment. Without this education, we would not know how to keep the environment healthy or what it even means to have a healthy environment. The environment is a living, breathing thing, just the same as a human, and without a healthy environment, we as a species would not be able to survive on Earth, which is why we need to do everything we can to ensure that the environment survives. Without the environmental movement, our society would be smog-filled and littered with garbage and pollutants. Because of the environmental movement, awareness was raised early enough to help us ensure that our environment was built to last. With the legislation that was passed, our environment can be healthy, but we still have a long ways to go. With alternative fuels being developed every day, fossil fuels will soon be eliminated entirely. When this happens, our environment will be protected for the future generations to come.